Hello everybody, Assalamu alaikum. Yes, today I'm going to talk about Islam, but I'm not going to rant about it. I don't suffer from raging Islamophobia. Whatever that is, it's a ridiculous concept. But there is a call for a serious conversation about Islam and some facts. Nearly 50 years ago, I sat under a tree in northern Nigeria talking to some farmers. This was the edge of the Sahara Desert, the land of the Hausa Fulani people, but really the domain of the Tuareg. The Tuareg are fierce, independent warriors. In the old days, they traded slaves across the Sahara Desert to the north. Yes, slaves and gold, a long time before Europeans ever found the Americas. Don't let me digress. This was my first mission overseas, and I was interviewing farmers about the tobacco industry which flourished in Sokoto province. These were Muslims, and it was my introduction to Islam. What struck me was their peacefulness and hospitality. Unlike in southern Nigeria, where crime was rampant, I felt safe here. The strict code of Sharia ensured that theft and other crimes were harshly punished, swiftly and harshly. Since then, I've worked throughout the Muslim world, most countries except, I think, Egypt and Iran, and I've never had much reason to change my opinion. Here's some statistics. The global Muslim population is just over 2 billion people, or 25% of the total world population, and it's a religion that includes many ethnicities. You don't have to be an Arab to be a Muslim. The majority of Muslims, of course, do reside in Asia Pacific and the Middle East, countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, India and Bangladesh. About 90% of Muslims are Sunni and the rest are Shia. But there are other sects. There are roughly 300 million Sufis. Sufism is the mystical aspects of Islam. We'll get to that in another episode. And then there are a smaller number of people who are called the Ahmadiyya, which is a small sect numbering about 20 million, originating in India. So why would you care? Why should we care about this? Well, we should. It's well attested in political science that a small minority, vociferous minority, with a simple message and a commitment to change will overturn a majority comfortable in its life and opinions. Think about the Bolsheviks in Tsarist Russia. In February 1917, the Bolshevik Party was only about 24,000 members. 6 months later, there were 10 times that number, and by October, they ran the show. Islam has a simple message that appeals to new adherents. It has 3 core ideas. Islam says that there is one God, referred to as Allah, who is the creator of the universe. There's no other deity worthy of worship except Allah. Muslims believe that Muhammad is the last prophet sent by God, by Allah, completing a long line of prophets that includes Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus. And Islam provides a framework for your entire life, for living a righteous life through its teachings. And that includes moral principles, social justice, and personal conduct. To be a Muslim is simple. There are no esoteric rituals, no need to remove parts of your body, cover yourself in ash, or be doused in water, let alone suffer long hours of meditation. The practice of Islam is structured around a behaviour known as the 5 pillars. And these pillars are: you have to declare your faith in God, in Allah, and the oneness of God and the Prophet Muhammad. You have to perform daily prayers 5 times to connect to God. You have to give to charity to support those in need and promote social welfare. You fast during Ramadan as a means of self-discipline and spiritual reflection. If you can, you go on the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And you do that once in your lifetime, but only if you can. It sounds easy. There's a clarity in this behaviour, and it's not bound up in all kinds of weirdness, ideas about original sin, torture on a cross, rising from the dead, and so on. Islam is a personal religion. There's not some old man in a funny hat in a cold church telling you about God. You communicate with God directly yourself. You don't have to believe in a pantheon of gods and goddesses with incomprehensible names, and some of whom look like elephants. Neither do you have to shave your head or wear payot, which are the side curls worn by Orthodox Jews. Circumcision is strongly encouraged for health reasons, but it's not mandatory. Of course, this tolerance does not extend to women. Here in Bangkok, hot and humid, you'll often find Muslim tourists who look like this. We'll return to the subject. Islam is not a religion, it's a culture. Let me propose an axiom. All formal religions are imaginative narratives. Human spirituality is undeniable, but I do say that clever people have used our real spiritual feelings to concoct all manner of fiction. I'll argue that they do so for status, for power, and for money. Undoubtedly, some of these people have genuine spiritual beliefs. To get crucified, burned at the stake for your beliefs does indicate some kind of genuine sincerity and commitment to what you think. Yet in terms of temporal organisation of all of this, formal religion, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, it's mainly about worldly advantage. I'm not selling Islam, but if I was, I'd say it was an easier sell than any of the other religions, the other narratives. The proof is in its spread. Islam has grown in my 75 years from 18% of the world's population to 25%, a significant rise in absolute numbers and as a proportion of the world's population. By 2060, it's estimated there could be 3 billion Muslims, about a third of all humans. That seems nothing to be concerned about. As I've said, my personal experience of Muslims has been benign. The foundations of the religion seem equally so. After all, who cares what you believe about some omniscient supreme being? If you venerate a chap who lived in the desert, good for you. Many probably prefer Taylor Swift. It's not so easy. Islam drags a lot of baggage along with it. Of course, all religions do, as one tries to gain advantage over another. Let's not forget the Crusades and the Holocaust. Nevertheless, these days, Islam has become almost synonymous with a list of awfulness. It's not hard to know when academic irritation with Islam turned into everyday fear. 9/11 and the destruction of the Twin Towers by Muslim extremists. Why the emphasis on Islam? There was all kinds of politics involved, and I've never heard that the attacks were aimed at purely religious point. But Al-Qaeda framed the attacks as jihad. It was voiced that Islamic holy sites should be liberated, and this was an act of redemption to restore a perceived moral order. This was a militant form of jihad, which was justified by Islam. Sadly, we all know the word jihad now. Most people equate it with holy war or terrorism. Few know that many Islamic scholars condemned 9/11 and, in such crimes, highlighting a community-wide disapproval of the similar acts of terrorism as violations of Islamic principles. Yet the ghastly attacks on Israel on the 7th of October 2023 were justified as jihad. In the UK, the police Operation Stovewood invested allegations of child sex abuse in Rotherham in the north between 1997 and 2013. It found that most of the 1,100 victims were white girls and about 80% of the perpetrators were of Pakistani heritage. Muslim community members rejected any connection with Islam. Nazir Afzal, chief Crown Prosecutor, himself a Muslim, argued that, quote, Islam says that alcohol, drugs, rape and abuse are all forbidden, yet these men were surrounded by all these things, unquote. At Rotherham, Iman Irfan Chisti expressed shock that fellow Muslims were being implicated in the actions of the perpetrators. Overall, while there were occasional references to Islamic concepts by the defendants at these trials, they were generally not framed as justifications for the crimes themselves. Nevertheless, a trawl through X, Twitter formerly, will show overwhelmingly that the international public associates Islam with bestial behaviour. I turned this up recently, a quote from a site called Jihad Watch, run by Robert Spencer. Quote, in France, a Muslim quoted the Quran while raping his victim. A survivor of a Muslim rape gang in the UK has said that her rapists would quote the Quran to her and believed their actions were justified by Islam. I've looked and I've been unable to find verifiable original sources for these claims that such actual crimes, there were the crimes, were directly linked to Islam. I can't find transcripts and I can't find newspaper articles that actually say that's what the defendants said or the survivors claimed. Perhaps, as Mr. Spencer said to me, I'm just a bad researcher. How did a religion aimed at peace, brotherhood, and a connection with God get so badly framed? I'll take a short break now. When we return, the next segment will establish some history and we'll look at the spread of Islam. Meantime, hi, if you're loving Quartermaine's episodes, please hit subscribe. I'll be absolutely thrilled. It'll really help us get views on YouTube. Thanks a lot. Welcome back. Working in Muslim countries is one thing. You wake up to the call to prayer and you accommodate your driver stopping on your way to an urgent appointment to make his prayers, and to fasting at Ramadan to support your colleagues. None of this is onerous. However, understanding Islam is more difficult. I've always focused on my work, so it wasn't until a friend asked me to read a very long draft manuscript of a monumental history of Islam that I started to learn. The work, Empires of the Book, The History of a Civilization, by Andrew Harvey, remains a work in progress. but it inspired me to write my third novel. Just one, Guardian of Kings. But that's for another story, another episode. What follows is taken largely from Andrew's book, Andrew's draft, though the opinions are my own, but I've used his text as my guide. Let me quote from Andrew's introduction. For hundreds of years, from late antiquity to the Industrial Revolution, Islamic states were numbered amongst the great powers. I do not believe we even understand our own history without some knowledge of them. In Europe, trade with them shaped the economies, translations shaped the intellectual life, while the conflict with the Ottoman Empire shaped the politics. For a while, Islam was overshadowed by the European Enlightenment. And then, in the late 20th century, events such as the Iranian Revolution, the rise of Islamic militancy in Syria, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan pushed Islam back into world affairs. By 1979, 1,400 years after the Prophet Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina, Islam and what Andrew calls revolutionary jihad were back. The falling Twin Towers in Manhattan established an iconic image of the impact that this version of jihad would have until the present day. It's perhaps been superseded by hang gliders arriving over a dance party in Israel on the 7th of October 2023, followed by the devastation of Gaza. There's no shortage of such images, some so upsetting that I won't show them. How has it occurred that a spiritual message conveyed by an angel for direct transmission by God's messenger arrives at such a pass? Yet, as Andrew says, quote, devout Muslims are the loyal citizens of dozens of countries and ask no more than to worship and conduct their personal lives in accordance with the faith, unquote. Reading his book, I wondered about the best place to start a short history of the rise of Islam. I doubt you want to hear about 3,000 years of the history of Arabia. So I hit on the year 541 AD, when the bubonic plague devastated two warring empires, Persia, the Sassanians, and Eastern Rome, the Byzantines. The Justinian plague may have caused the deaths of up to 100 million people, reducing the population of the Byzantine Empire, centered on Constantinople, now Istanbul, by as much as half. The death toll in the Persian Empire, the Sassanians, was catastrophic. About half the population of the western provinces died. Both large empires were in collapse, but the Arab population was virtually untouched, unaffected. Islam emerged in a power vacuum as a unifying force amongst disparate tribes. Around 610 AD, a middle-aged trader known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, started to preach submission, Islam, to one God, Allah. Those who submitted were called Muslim, one who submits. Perhaps if Muhammad ibn Abdullah had left it at that, Islam would have remained a small, obscure Arab religion. But instead, he had a doctrine of reform, which was aimed at transforming society, promoting justice, equality, and community cohesion. God's messages soon turned political, and Islam rapidly expanded through a combination of military conquests and trade. Muslim communities were theocracies, and power was in the hands of those who best were able to convey Islam. The message was absolutist, easily imposed, and that allowed for the consolidation of power and the spread of Islamic beliefs across the Arabian Peninsula. Islam also involved cultural exchanges that shaped peoples as the territory expanded. Islamic teachings influenced art, science, philosophy, and this rich intellectual tradition persisted as divisions of theology emerged and political power shifted. After the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 AD, his successors, known as caliphs, continued the expansion, and within a century, a vast Islamic empire stretched from Spain to India. Nothing in the early development of the Dar al-Islam, the Islamic world, was peaceful. Islam was a maelstrom. Anybody who believed that Islam kept to the ideal of the early, peaceful, revelatory communion with Allah was disabused during the Prophet's conquests. However, things became more violent when the Prophet effected his joyful ascension to paradise. A major conflict arose over who should lead the Muslim community. Sunnis supported the election of Abu Bakr as the first caliph, while Shia Muslims believed the leadership should stay with Muhammad's family, specifically with Ali, his cousin and son-in-law. In the civil war that followed, Ali was killed, and that led to the major division that's kept going ever since between Sunni and Shia. The Umayyad family were Arabs originally from Mecca. They emerged as victors in this fight and were able to establish a caliphate based in Damascus in Syria. And this was primarily an Arab Sunni regime. Needless to say, they outstayed their welcome. They were corrupt and inefficient, and they despised minorities and the Shia faction. Grievances led to revolts, including the Second Civil War, it's called the Second Fitna, ignited by the brutal killings of Hussein ibn Ali at the Battle of Karbala in 680 AD. What followed was the Abbasid Revolution, and that resulted in a new caliphate in Baghdad that shifted power to a more diverse and inclusive community. Islam expanded further east from Yemen by traders moving to India, and Muhammad bin Qasim's conquest of the Sindh in 711 AD allowed various dynasties in India to emerge, including the Ghaznavids and the Ghurids, leading to the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in the 13th century. And don't forget that India was dominated by the Muslim Mughal regime for about 300 years before the British Raj took over. Trade along the Silk Road through Central Asia brought Islam to China. During the Mongol Yuan dynasty, the Mongols employed Muslim officials and military leaders, and invasions went the other way, from the east to the west, and the Seljuks confronted the remains of the Byzantine Empire in the 11th century. As Islam expanded, conflicts arose everywhere. There were the Crusades in the 11th to the 13th centuries, and these were military campaigns by Europeans trying to hold back the resurgence or the surge of Islam into Europe, where at one time they reached as far as Vienna. The Ottoman Empire grew from the beginning of the 14th century and lasted until 1922, and was a period of relative stability and expansion. But it still faced challenges that were internal and nationalism within ethnic groups within its borders. The irony is that while continually asserting itself as a religion of peaceful submission to the will of God, Islam advanced more by the sword and political and economic power than by spiritual practice. Islam's wars for Muslims have often been fought righteously as jihad against the kafir, the unbelievers. But at the same time, they've been fought equally and more brutally between different factions of Islam itself. Islam was conceived, washed, schooled, and grew up in the blood of millions. In the next episode, I'll turn to examine the Prophet Muhammad, who started all of this. And then, in a final episode, we'll look at what the social structure of Islam is prescribed under Sharia. I hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Watch for the next episode.